N.N.I. Miller walked up the broken steps of Pine Valley Church on a cold October night. The old church stood at the end of Oak Street, looking scarier than ever in the dark. At 25, Jenny worked for the Daily News, the only newspaper in the small town of Pine Valley. She loved her job as a reporter, but today was different. That morning, she had found something strange on her desk, a letter that would change everything. Inside the plain white envelope was a half-burned red candle and a note that read, "Your Grandpa Bob knew our secret. Come to Pine Valley Church at midnight. Come by yourself." Jenny's hands shook as she looked at the candle. There were teeth marks on it, her grandpa's teeth marks. She'd never forget how Grandpa Bob used to chew on candles while thinking about his newspaper stories. Her Grandma Sue would always tell him off for this odd habit. But Grandpa Bob disappeared 15 years ago, back when Jenny was just 10. No one ever found out what happened to him. The big church doors made a loud squeaking sound as Jenny pushed them open. The noise bounced off the walls of the empty church, which hadn't been used for regular Sunday services in 5 years. When she turned on her flashlight, she saw something weird. Little red candles were scattered all over the floor near the front of the church. The melted wax had made strange shapes that looked like someone had written something in a language she didn't know. The air smelled funny too, like burned candy mixed with a metallic smell that reminded her of coins. Suddenly, she saw something move in the back row of seats. "Is anyone there?" she called out, her voice shaking. Nobody answered. Jenny walked closer, her heart beating fast. What she found wasn't a person at all. It was her grandpa's old brown jacket, placed on the seat to look like someone was sitting there. On the jacket was a large yellow envelope, looking old and worn but sealed with fresh red wax. With shaking fingers, Jenny picked up the envelope. The red wax seal had a weird pattern on it, the same pattern she had just seen in the melted candle wax on the floor. Inside were her grandpa's old notebooks, filled with his messy writing. But what really scared her was the picture she found clipped to the first page. It showed 12 people wearing black robes with hoods standing in a circle right here in this church. Each person held a red candle. In the middle of their circle was something so strange that Jenny had to blink several times to make sure she wasn't seeing things. It looked like a dark shadow that seemed to move even though it was just a photograph. When she turned the picture over, she found 3 words written in her grandpa's handwriting: "The Shadow Eaters." Just then, she heard a loud bang from underneath the church. Her flashlight started blinking and then went completely dark. In the pitch blackness, she could hear footsteps coming up from the basement stairs. They were slow, heavy steps that didn't sound like they belonged to any normal person. One by one, the red candles on the floor began lighting up by themselves. Their red light made scary shadows dance on the walls. Jenny tried to run, but she couldn't move her feet. It was like they were glued to the floor. The footsteps got closer and closer. She looked at the photograph again in the red candlelight. This time, the dark shape in the middle seemed to be moving, like a video playing on the paper. Then she noticed something else. One of the hooded figures was shorter than the others, and a piece of familiar brown jacket sleeve was sticking out from under the black robe. Before Jenny could even scream, she heard a soft voice behind her. "I was wondering when another Miller would come looking." Jenny spun around to face the voice, but what she saw made her realize that finding out what happened to her grandpa might cost her more than just a good newspaper story. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Rose, her old third-grade teacher, but something was terribly wrong with her face. It seemed to shift and change in the red candlelight, like it wasn't quite human anymore. In Mrs. Rose's wrinkled hands was a black robe, just like the ones in the photograph, and as Jenny watched, unable to look away, 12 more figures in black robes stepped out of the shadows, each holding a red candle. "Your grandpa made his choice," Mrs. Rose said softly. "Now it's your turn." The photograph in Jenny's hand suddenly felt warm, and when she looked down at it one last time, she saw that the dark shape in the middle had disappeared completely, and in the red candlelight she could swear she saw it moving across the church floor, coming straight toward her. Jenny's legs finally started working again, but instead of running away, she found herself walking toward Mrs. Rose. It was like someone else was controlling her body. The old teacher's face kept changing. One moment it looked normal, the next moment it seemed to melt like the red candles on the floor. "Sit down, dear," Mrs. Rose said, pointing to a wooden chair that Jenny was sure hadn't been there a moment ago. "It's time you learned what your grandpa discovered 15 years ago." As Jenny sat, the 12 hooded figures formed a circle around her, their red candles making the church feel warmer than it should. Mrs. Rose pulled out an old leather book from her bag. "Pine Valley has a secret, Jenny. A hungry secret." She opened the book to show drawings of the same shadow creature Jenny had seen in the photograph. They came here 100 years ago. The Shadow Eaters. They were starving, you see. They feed on people's darkest thoughts, their worst memories, their deepest fears. One of the hooded figures stepped forward and lowered their hood. Jenny gasped. It was Mr. Tom, the friendly mailman who had delivered mail to her house for 20 years. But like Mrs. Rose, his face wasn't quite right. "Your grandpa was a smart man," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "Too smart. He figured out why people in Pine Valley never stayed sad or angry for long, why no one here ever had nightmares." Another hood came down, this time revealing Ms. Green, who ran the town's only grocery store. "We made a deal with them," she said, her eyes glowing slightly red in the candlelight. "The Shadow Eaters take away our dark thoughts, our painful memories. In return, they get to feed. The red candles bind the agreement." Jenny's mind was spinning. But what happened to Grandpa Bob? Why did he disappear? Mrs. Rose smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile anymore. "Oh, he didn't disappear, dear. He joined us, became one of the feeders. That's what we call ourselves. We keep the Shadow Eaters happy, find them new food sources." She touched Jenny's shoulder with ice-cold fingers. "But sometimes they need something more than just dark thoughts. Sometimes they need a whole person, someone full of questions and curiosity. Someone like your grandpa was, someone like you are now." The dark shape from the photograph was moving faster now, swirling around Jenny's feet like black smoke. She tried to stand up, but invisible hands pushed her back down. "Don't worry," Mrs. Rose said softly. "Your grandpa is still here. Show her, Bob." The last hooded figure stepped forward. As the hood fell back, Jenny screamed. It looked like her grandpa, but his face was like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long, faded and warped. His eyes were completely black, like empty holes in his face. When he spoke, his voice sounded like rustling paper. "I'm sorry, Jenny. I tried to warn you with the photograph, but once you see them, once you know about them, you have to choose, become a feeder or become food." Mrs. Rose held out the black robe again. "So what will it be, Jenny? Will you join your grandpa? Help us keep Pine Valley's perfect little secret? Or ... She gestured to the shadow creature that was now rising up like a wave of darkness behind Jenny's chair. Just then, Jenny remembered something. The letter on her desk had come in a plain white envelope, but she'd found a red envelope in her mailbox last week. She'd thrown it away without opening it. Had that been the real warning from her grandpa? Was this all some kind of trick? The red candles flickered as if they could sense her doubt. She looked at the faces around her, Mrs. Rose, Mr. Tom, Ms. Green, and the thing that used to be her grandpa. Were they really who they claimed to be? Or were the shadow eaters better at creating illusions than they were letting on? As if reading her thoughts, the shadow creature suddenly pulled back, and for just a second, Jenny saw something in Mrs. Rose's eyes that looked a lot like fear. Jenny's mind raced as she stared at Mrs. Rose's frightened expression. The old teacher quickly tried to hide it, but Jenny had seen enough. She remembered something else too, her mom's words from years ago. The trick to knowing what's real, Jenny, is to look for the small mistakes. Looking around now, she noticed things she'd missed before. Mr. Tom's mailman badge was on the wrong side of his uniform. Ms. Green's famous red hair was parted on the left instead of the right, and her grandpa, he was wearing his brown jacket, but Grandpa Bob had given that jacket to charity a week before he disappeared. Jenny had been there when he dropped it off. "You're not real," Jenny said, standing up suddenly. "None of you are real." Her voice got stronger. "The real Mrs. Rose moved to Florida 5 years ago. I get Christmas cards from her every year." The creature that looked like Mrs. Rose hissed, its face melting like a candle in summer heat. The other figures started changing too, their fake human faces dripping away like wet paint. The shadow creature behind Jenny made a sound like crumpling paper, but before anything else could happen, a new voice rang out from the church entrance. "Jenny, catch!" Something small and red flew through the air. Jenny caught it. It was the red envelope she'd thrown away last week. As she held it, all the red candles in the church suddenly blazed brighter, making the shadow creatures shriek. In the doorway stood old Miss Betty, the church cleaning lady everyone thought was crazy because she always carried red candles in her pockets. But she didn't look crazy now. She looked ready for battle. "Open it," Miss Betty shouted, pulling more red candles from her coat. "Your grandpa gave me that envelope 15 years ago. Told me to wait until they tried this again." Jenny's fingers trembled as she tore open the red envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words written in red ink. "The shadow eaters aren't real, Jenny. They're reflections of our own fears. The red candles don't control them. They control the red candles. Look in their eyes and you'll see yourself." The fake Mrs. Rose lunged at Jenny, but now Jenny stood her ground. She looked straight into the creature's eyes and saw something that made her gasp. It wasn't a monster looking back at her. It was her own reflection, twisted by fear. "They're like mirrors," Miss Betty called out, throwing red candles into the circle. "Dark mirrors that show us what we're afraid of becoming. Your grandpa figured it out. That's why they had to make him disappear, but not the way they want you to think." The shadow creature was getting bigger, feeding off the fear in the room. But Jenny wasn't afraid anymore. She grabbed one of the red candles and held it up. "Where's my grandpa?" she demanded. "What really happened to him?" The thing wearing Mrs. Rose's melting face started laughing, a horrible sound like breaking glass. "Clever girl," it said, in a voice that wasn't Mrs. Rose's anymore. "But do you really want to know? Some truths are worse than shadows." Miss Betty stepped into the circle of candles. "Tell her the truth about apartment 4B, she said firmly. "Tell her about the basement of Turner's bookstore. Tell her why the clock tower hasn't worked since that night 15 years ago." Jenny's heart skipped a beat. The clock tower. She'd always wondered why it stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m. the night her grandpa disappeared. And Turner's bookstore had been closed for 15 years, its basement sealed with heavy chains. As for apartment 4B, Jenny had never heard of it, but something about that number made her skin crawl. The shadow creature moved closer, its darkness taking the shape of a door. On that door was a number, 4B. "Want to see what's behind it?" the creature asked in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers at once. "Want to know why your grandpa really chewed on red candles? It wasn't a nervous habit, Jenny. He was leaving us a trail of breadcrumbs, and you just found the first one. Jenny stared at the shadow door marked 4B, her heart pounding. Miss Betty moved closer, gripping a red candle like a weapon. "Your grandpa lived in apartment 4B at Pine Valley Towers," she said quietly. "But here's something nobody knows. There is no apartment 4B in that building. Never was." The fake Mrs. Rose's face had completely melted away now, leaving something that looked like a dark mirror floating in the air. In it, Jenny could see flashes of memories that weren't hers. Her grandpa sitting at his desk, chewing on a red candle while writing in his notebook. But there was something odd about the scene. The numbers on the clock behind him were running backward. "Time moves differently in 4B, the mirror thing whispered. "Your grandpa found out how to open doors that shouldn't exist. He found us, but we weren't what he expected. We were so much better." "Lies." Miss Betty threw another red candle into the circle. "Tell her about Sarah." The shadow creatures hissed at the name. Jenny felt a chill run down her spine. "Who's Sarah?" "Your grandfather's first wife," Miss Betty said. "The one nobody remembers except me. She disappeared 3 months before he married your grandmother. The town forgot her, like they forgot about apartment 4B, like they're trying to make everyone forget about your grandpa." Suddenly, the shadow door swung open. Behind it was a long, dark hallway that couldn't possibly fit inside the church. Numbers floated in the darkness: 4B, 3B, 2B, 1B, and then 0B, -1B, -2B, each one glowing with a sickly red light. "Want to know why the clock tower stopped?" the mirror thing asked. "Time was leaking. Too many doors were opening. Your grandpa tried to close them, but he needed help. That's why he left the clues in the candles." Jenny remembered something. She'd found her grandpa's old box of candles in the attic last summer. She'd thought it was strange that each one had different numbers carved into the bottom. 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4, 5, 5, 5. "They're not numbers," Miss Betty said, as if reading her mind. "They're times. Times when the doors are weakest. Your grandpa wasn't just chewing on candles. He was marking them, creating a map." The shadow creature that had pretended to be Mr. Tom started laughing. "A map to nowhere," it said. "Every door leads to us. Ask Sarah. Ask all the others who went looking for answers." But Jenny wasn't listening to the creature anymore. She was looking at the red candle in her hand. There was a number carved into this one too, 999. And wasn't it strange that the clock tower had stopped at 333? 3 threes, like the first number in her grandpa's code. "The basement of Turner's bookstore," Jenny said slowly. "It's not really sealed, is it? It's another door." The shadow creatures went completely still. Even the mirror thing stopped whispering. Miss Betty smiled, a real warm smile that reminded Jenny of summer days and hope. "Now you're asking the right questions," Miss Betty said. "But here's a better one. Why do you think these creatures are so desperate to keep us away from that basement? What's really down there?" Before anyone could answer, a deep bell began to toll. But the church didn't have a bell tower. The sound was coming from the shadow door, from somewhere deep in those impossible negative numbers. And with each toll, the red candles flickered, showing glimpses of other places, other rooms. And in one of them, just for a second, Jenny saw her grandpa, the real one. He was sitting at a desk covered in red candles, and he was writing something. When he looked up, his eyes were clear and normal, and he was smiling. In front of him was a book titled The Truth About Shadow Doors. The mirror thing screamed, a sound like breaking windows. "Enough! Choose now, Jenny Miller. Come through the door willingly, or we'll show you what really happened to Sarah." But Jenny had noticed something else in that glimpse of her grandpa. On his desk was a red candle with the number 777 carved into it. and around his neck was a key on a red ribbon. The same key she'd found in her cereal box that morning, the one she'd thought was a toy and put in her pocket. Miss Betty saw it too. "The key," she gasped. "Quick, child, what color is the ribbon really?" Jenny pulled out the key. In the red candlelight, the ribbon wasn't red at all. It was black. "Black ribbon means it's a true door key," Miss Betty said quickly, her eyes shining with excitement. "Your grandpa left it knowing they can't touch black ribbons. It burns them. That's why they use red for everything, to cover up the real colors of things." The shadow creatures backed away from the key, their dark shapes rippling like disturbed water. The mirror thing that had been Mrs. Rose flickered, showing different faces: Sarah, Grandpa Bob, other people Jenny didn't recognize. All of them looked scared. "The basement of Turner's bookstore isn't just another door," Miss Betty explained, pulling Jenny toward the church exit. "It's the first door. Your grandpa found it when he was investigating missing library books. Books that disappeared but still showed up in the return box, dripping with red wax." They ran through the dark streets of Pine Valley, the shadow creatures following like black fog. The key grew warm in Jenny's hand. Behind them, she could hear the toll of that impossible bell. 1, 2, 3. "Why did Sarah really disappear?" Jenny asked as they ran. "What did she find?" "She found out their weakness," Miss Betty panted. "These creatures, they're not shadow eaters. They're memory collectors. They take memories and twist them, make them red instead of what they really are. But Sarah, she worked at the paint store. She knew all about colors. She figured out that every real memory has its true color." They reached Turner's bookstore. The chains on the basement door looked solid, but when Jenny touched them with the black ribboned key, they dissolved like sugar in rain. "Your grandpa didn't disappear," Miss Betty said as they hurried down the creaky steps. "He found a way to store real memories in different colored candles. The red ones are fakes. That's why he left them everywhere to confuse them. The real memories are in black candles hidden in plain sight." The basement was huge, much bigger than it should have been. Shelves stretched up into darkness, but they weren't filled with books. They held thousands of candles of every color imaginable, and at the center of the room was a simple wooden desk. On it sat a black candle, burning with a flame that showed all colors of the rainbow. "That's Sarah's candle," Miss Betty whispered. "Your grandpa saved her memories in it. She's not gone. She's hiding in the colors, waiting, just like he is." The shadow creatures poured down the stairs like dark water. The mirror thing reformed, but now it couldn't hold a single shape. It kept changing. Mrs. Rose, Mr. Tom, Ms. Green, Grandpa Bob, Sarah, and faces Jenny had seen around town her whole life. "You can't light the black candle," it said in 1,000 voices at once. "You'll break everything we built. This town needs us. We take away their pain, their fear, their bad memories." "You take everything," Jenny said, understanding finally. "You replace real memories with red ones. You make people forget what really happened. But why? What are you hiding from?" The mirror thing trembled. "From them," it whispered. And for the first time, Jenny heard real fear in its voice. Just then, the bell tolled a 4th time. The black candle's rainbow flame flickered, and in its light, Jenny saw something written on the desk. "Count the colors, not the numbers. Red is their lie. Black is our truth. But rainbow shows the way home." Jenny looked at the key in her hand, then at Miss Betty, who nodded. "Your grandpa knew you'd figure it out," the old woman said. "Now, what color do you think that bell really is?" Before Jenny could answer, the shadow creatures surged forward. But as they did, the black candle's flame suddenly shot up to the ceiling, splitting into 7 perfect beams of light: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And in each color, Jenny saw a different truth. The shadow creatures screamed as the colors touched them, their darkness breaking apart to reveal what they really were. Empty picture frames, waiting to be filled with stolen memories. And through the rainbow light, Jenny saw something else. A door that hadn't been there before, marked not with a number, but with a single word, truth. Jenny reached for the truth door's handle, but Miss Betty grabbed her wrist. Wait! Your grandpa left one more clue, the cereal box. Check inside it again. Jenny remembered there had been something else in her cereal box that morning besides the key. A small paper fortune, like the ones in fortune cookies. She'd put it in her back pocket, thinking it was just a toy too. When she pulled it out now, the rainbow light made the words glow. To find the real door. Find the real bell. The shadow creatures were breaking apart, but they weren't disappearing. Instead, they were turning into something else. Blank pages floating in the air, waiting to be written on. The mirror thing made one last try to look like Mrs. Rose, but now Jenny could see right through it. It wasn't a mirror at all. It was a window, and behind it were thousands of stolen memories, all glowing red. The clock tower, Jenny suddenly said. The bell that's been ringing, it's coming from the clock tower, not these shadow doors. That's why they made it stop at 3:33. They're not just hiding time, they're hiding the real bell. Miss Betty smiled. Now you understand. These creatures, they're not the real enemy. They're just hiding from something worse, something that lives in the clock tower, something that collects storytellers. A chill ran down Jenny's spine. Storytellers? Think about it, Miss Betty said. Your grandpa was a reporter. Sarah worked at the paint store, but she also wrote children's books. Every person who disappeared in Pine Valley was someone who told stories, who could make people see things in new ways. These shadow creatures don't eat memories. They protect them by turning them red, hiding them from the bellkeeper. The floating pages started moving, forming words in the air. Jenny read them. The bellkeeper takes those who can change stories. It lives between the colors, in the space where black turns to red and back again. It's been collecting storytellers for centuries, turning them into bells that ring out forgotten tales. That's why Grandpa Bob left the candles, Jenny said, understanding more. The red ones were decoys. The black ones hide real memories. But the rainbow light, it shows the way to the clock tower, doesn't it? To save everyone who was taken? Before Miss Betty could answer, the bell tolled a fifth time. But this time, Jenny heard something in its ring. Words hidden in the sound. A story trying to be told. It's Grandpa Bob, she whispered. He's in the clock tower. He's become one of the bells. And Sarah. Listen closer, Miss Betty said. Count the echoes. Jenny closed her eyes and counted. 1 echo, 2, 3, 7 echoes, 7 colors of the rainbow. When she opened her eyes again, she knew what she had to do. The shadow creatures were trying to protect me, she said, because I'm a reporter, like Grandpa Bob. The bellkeeper would want me too. But they didn't know about the black ribbon or the rainbow light. They didn't know Grandpa Bob found a way to fight back. She held up the black ribboned key. In the rainbow light, 7 small symbols appeared on it, 1 for each color, not numbers this time, musical notes. It's not just a key, Miss Betty said proudly. It's a song. The one song the bellkeeper can't stand. The truth told in 7 different ways. Your grandpa wrote it, Sarah colored it, and now you have to sing it. The floating pages swirled faster, forming a tornado of blank paper. At its center, a new door appeared, crystal clear, like a drop of pure water. Through it, they could see the clock tower. Its bell was glowing with a strange light, not red or black or rainbow, but something in between. And in that light, faces appeared. All the storytellers the bellkeeper had taken over the years, each one turned into a bell, each one ringing out their unfinished tales. "Ready?" Miss Betty asked, taking out one last candle, this one clear as glass. "Once we go through that door, we'll have to face the bell-keeper. Are you ready to see what a story really looks like when it's not hidden in red or black or even rainbow colors?" Jenny gripped the black ribbon key tight and nodded. As they stepped through the crystal door, the basement of Turner's bookstore disappeared. They were now standing at the base of the clock tower, but it looked different than Jenny remembered. It stretched up into darkness with no top in sight. The walls were made of thousands of bells, each one a different size, each one containing a trapped storyteller. "Look at the hands on the clock," Miss Betty whispered, pointing up. The giant clock face above them wasn't showing 3:33 anymore. Instead, its hands were spinning backward and forward, as if time couldn't make up its mind which way to go. And in the center of the clock, where the hands met, sat a creature that made Jenny's heart stop. The bell-keeper looked like an old librarian, but its skin was made of turning pages, and its eyes were two empty inkwells, dripping black tears. When it spoke, its voice sounded like paper being slowly torn. "Another Miller," it said, smiling with teeth made of typewriter keys. "How wonderful! Your grandfather's bell has such a lovely ring to it. And Sarah's chime. Oh, it tells the most beautiful stories. Would you like to hear them?" The bell-keeper reached out and touched one of the bells. It rang, and suddenly Jenny could hear her grandpa's voice, telling a story about a brave girl who had to save her town. Another bell rang, Sarah's bell, and Jenny heard a tale about colors that could trap shadows. They're not just bells, Jenny realized. They're books that never got written, stories that never got told. "Of course they are," the bell-keeper said proudly. "I collect them, keep them safe. In my tower, stories can never end. They ring forever, telling themselves over and over. No one can change them. No one can ruin them. They stay perfect." But Jenny saw something the bell-keeper didn't want her to see. Behind its smile, behind its paper skin, there was fear. Fear of stories that could change, of tales that could grow and shift and become something new. "That's why you take storytellers," she said. "You're afraid of what they might write, what they might change." The bell-keeper's smile disappeared. Stories should stay the same. When people change them, they ruin them. They forget the proper endings. They mix up the morals. They need someone to keep them straight, keep them right. Jenny looked at the key in her hand, at the 7 musical notes glowing in rainbow colors. She understood now. Every story had 7 parts, just like there were 7 colors in a rainbow. And each part could change, could grow, could become something new. "Grandpa Bob knew you were wrong," Jenny said bravely. "He wrote a story about you, didn't he? A story that could change. That's why you took him." The bell-keeper screeched, a sound like 1,000 books being slammed shut at once. His story was dangerous. It told people they could change the endings. It told them they could write their own stories. "Good stories are supposed to change," Jenny said, raising the key. "They grow with each person who tells them. That's what makes them magical." She began to sing the notes on the key. Each note rang out in a different color. Red for courage, orange for friendship, yellow for hope, green for growth, blue for truth, indigo for mystery, and violet for magic. As she sang, the bells in the tower started to ring too. Not the trapped, endless chimes the bell-keeper wanted, but new songs, changing songs. The bell-keeper screamed again, but this time in fear. Its paper skin began to tear, showing nothing but empty space underneath. "Stop! You'll ruin everything. The stories, they have to stay the same." But the bells rang louder. Jenny could hear hundreds of voices now, all telling their stories, all changing them, making them new. She heard Grandpa Bob's voice, strong and clear. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that surprise us with new endings. And then she heard Sarah's voice. The most beautiful colors are the ones we've never seen before. The clock hands spun faster and faster as more bells joined the song. The bellkeeper tried to cover its inkwell eyes, but it was too late. Stories were changing all around it, growing, becoming new tales that had never been told before. The bellkeeper began to shrink as the stories grew stronger. Its paper skin was tearing faster now, revealing more empty spaces. But then it started to laugh. A horrible sound like old books crumbling to dust. "Foolish girl," it wheezed. "You think freeing them will save them? Look what happens to stories when they change too much." The bellkeeper waved its hand and suddenly all the bells turned clear as glass. Inside each one, Jenny could see the trapped storytellers, but they were changing too. Their faces were becoming blank, like empty pages. "Every time a story changes, the original gets weaker," the bellkeeper said. "Soon there will be nothing left of them. Nothing left of your grandpa, of Sarah, of any of them." Jenny's song faltered. Was the bellkeeper right? She looked at Miss Betty in panic, but the old woman was smiling. "Jenny," Miss Betty said calmly, "what's your favorite story that your grandpa used to tell you?" "The one about the girl who painted the moon," Jenny said without thinking. "But he told it differently every time." Suddenly, Jenny understood. She'd loved that story exactly because it changed. Sometimes the girl used silver paint, sometimes gold. Sometimes she painted stars too, sometimes clouds. Every version had been different, but they were all true. "You're wrong," Jenny told the bellkeeper. "Stories don't get weaker when they change, they get stronger. Every new telling adds something. Every change makes them bigger." She started singing again, but this time she changed the notes, adding her own. The rainbow lights swirled around her, and now she could see something amazing. Every bell in the tower was connected to another by thin threads of light, like a giant spider web made of stories. "They're not separate stories at all," she gasped. "They're all connected. Every story ever told is part of one big story." The bellkeeper shrieked. "No! Stories must stay in their proper places. They can't mix together." But it was too late. The bells were ringing together now, their songs weaving into one giant tale. Jenny saw her grandpa's stories flowing into Sarah's, which flowed into other stories, then more and more. Colors mixed and swirled, creating new shades that had never existed before. The blank faces in the bells began to fill with color. They weren't disappearing. They were becoming more real than ever. Inside his bell, Grandpa Bob winked at Jenny. Inside hers, Sarah was painting with colors Jenny had never seen before. "Quick!" Miss Betty shouted over the ringing bells. "The key! Put it in the clock!" Jenny looked up at the huge clock face, still spinning wildly. In the center, right where the hands met, she saw something she hadn't noticed before, a tiny keyhole. She lifted the key, but the bellkeeper made one last desperate move. Its paper skin exploded outward, turning into thousands of blank pages that swirled around Jenny like a tornado. "If you turn that key," it hissed, "all the stories will mix together. No one will know which ending belongs to which story anymore." "Maybe that's how it should be," Jenny said. "Maybe the best stories are the ones we make together." She pushed through the whirlwind of blank pages and reached up with the key. As she did, she felt other hands helping her. Hundreds of storytellers, all reaching through their bells, all adding their strength to hers. The key slid into the lock. Jenny took a deep breath and whispered, "Every story needs a new chapter." Then she turned the key. The moment the key turned, everything changed. The clock tower filled with an explosion of colors no one had ever seen before. The bellkeeper's blank pages turned into butterflies made of living stories, each wing containing a different tale. The bells didn't just ring. They sang, laughed, and cried, telling 1,000 stories at once. But the biggest surprise was Miss Betty. As the stories swirled around her, her appearance began to change. Her gray hair turned into flowing rainbow colors, and her cleaning lady uniform transformed into a dress made of moving pictures and words. "Betty isn't really my name," she said, her voice now sounding like 1,000 whispered stories. "I'm the story keeper, the bellkeeper's sister. We were created to watch over stories together, but we saw our job differently. While my brother tried to keep stories locked up and unchanged, I believed in letting them grow." Jenny's mind was spinning. "You've been watching over Pine Valley all this time? Protecting us?" "Protecting the stories," Miss Betty, the story keeper, corrected. "Your grandfather and Sarah figured out who I was. They helped me hide the true stories in different colored candles while my brother wasn't looking. But we needed someone brave enough to set them free, someone who could understand that endings can change." The bellkeeper was shrinking more and more, turning into a small, sad book with a locked cover. "Sister," it whispered, "what have you done?" "The stories. They're all mixing together. How will anyone know which is which?" "They'll know," the story keeper said gently, "because each person who reads them will make them their own. That's the real magic of stories. They grow with us, change with us, become part of us." Suddenly, all the bells in the tower began to glow. One by one, they transformed back into people. Jenny watched as her grandpa stepped out of his bell, looking exactly as she remembered him. Sarah appeared next to him, her painter's smock covered in impossible colors. "Jenny," Grandpa Bob said, hugging her tight, "you figured it out. You understood what I was trying to tell you with the candles." "The red ones were fake," Jenny said. "The black ones hid the truth. But it was the rainbow that showed us how stories can change." Sarah smiled, taking Grandpa Bob's hand. "And now it's time to tell a new story. One where the past isn't forgotten, just transformed." The story keeper picked up the small, sad book that had been her brother. "Every story deserves a chance to change," she said. "Even his." She opened the book, and from its pages rose all the memories the bellkeeper had tried to keep locked away. Every changed ending, every new version, every different way of telling the same tale. But instead of causing chaos like the bellkeeper had feared, the stories began to dance together, creating new tales that were somehow familiar and completely new at the same time. Jenny watched in amazement as her grandfather's newspaper stories mixed with Sarah's children's books, creating something wonderful and strange and true. "What happens now?" Jenny asked, looking around at all the freed storytellers, each glowing with their own special light. The story keeper smiled, her rainbow dress shimmering with 1,000,000 different tales. "Now, my dear, you get to write the next chapter. But first, there's something you should know about your own story, something about why you love stories so much. You see, the night you were born,